Welcome to another episode of The Unseen Paranormal, where some of the scariest things are unseen. I'm your host, Eric Freeman. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's show. Today we have a great guest for you. We're talking to Thomas Freese. Thomas is an author, storyteller, artist, and art therapist. He has a master's in expressive therapies and a bachelor's in psychology. He has written 11 books and 200 articles and reviews. Some of his titles include Haunted Battlefields of the South, Eerie Encounters in Everyday Life, and Ghosts, Spirits, and Angels, True Tales from Kentucky and Beyond. You can find his books and audiobooks at his website, thomasfreese.com, and on Amazon. Welcome to the show, Thomas. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, my pleasure. It's the season. It's October, and we got to tell some ghost stories.
Right. You've written lots of books on the paranormal, not just about ghosts, but also about angels and spirits and other things, and kind of carrying on that tradition of folklore and storytelling, which is kind of, unfortunately, a dying art. So how did you get into the paranormal and into writing about the paranormal?
Ever since I was young, I would say like middle school, I was really fascinated with unusual stories. So I remember Scholastic Books had this wonderful little book called Strangely Enough, and actually it's still on Scholastic even after all these decades. And I got a hold of that, and I was reading about, Bermuda Triangle and, all kinds of crazy ghost stories and the devil's footprints and raining frogs and just anything weird and unusual. I just kind of ate it up with a spoon. And then when I was about 12 years old, I heard this really loud noise in the middle of the night. It woke me up. It sounded like someone had slammed their fist against the wall, and I waited to listen, and I didn't hear my dad fumbling around cussing or anything, so he wasn't checking on anything. And my brother Mike had the top bunk. I was in the bottom bunk. I was a year younger, and so I would sometimes him, before we go to sleep, and I said, "Mike, did you hear that?" And he said, "Yes." So I knew it wasn't just my imagination. So I was determined the next day to ask my mom about it because, being a kid, they're curious and they have questions about the paranormal or the metaphysical or the spiritual. And so my mom, though, is very logical. She's like Spock, just left brain, very smart, mathematical, analytical. And so I knew she was going to say no. So the question was, have you ever seen or heard anything you can't explain? So, with that bump of the night, I just wanted to know what she had to say. And when I tell ghost stories to kids, I say, hey, talk to a grown-up that you trust, whether it's, parents, grandparents, a teacher, whoever, and just, if you see or hear something you don't understand, just, tell them, ask them about it. So anyway, she did say no, but then after a few beats, she said, well, there was a time. And she told me my first ghost story, outside, of course, what you see on TV growing up with Disney and Casper the Ghost and everything. And my mom said that she was riding a horse up at the old Pioneer Cemetery. We grew up in St. Louis, and outside St. Louis was my great-aunt's farm, 200 acres of history and mystery. And when she was young, so it's my great-aunts and her aunts, and she would just ride one of the horses there. But this horse tended to stumble, and that's important for the story. She came up in the old Pioneer tombstone there. There was a guy sitting there. She didn't know. She knew the local farmers. And she said he had a long gray beard and was wearing old-time clothes. Just then, the horse stumbled, of course. She looked down for a moment to attend to the horse. When she looked up again, he had vanished. So I thought if my very logical mom has seen a ghost, then there's really something there. So that convinced me that it wasn't just fiction, that people really do have experiences. And just over the years and decades, more and more, I just got more fascinated. I started keeping a file. I worked as an artist in residence, going all around Kentucky, all these different counties, and then just some traveling a little bit in the United States and different places I lived. And everywhere I was, people had some ghost stories. So at some point, I just started collecting them. Actually, it was I was a Shaker singer, volunteer singer at the old Shaker Village near Harrodsburg, Kentucky. There were so many stories there. People were talking all the time, and mostly it was employees because they were there, not just for the singing, but during the day, and all week. So I took a recorder and took a notebook and made up a form for signed release, and I started collecting stories. So that was my first book. The research I did was in '98, but I didn't get it published till 2005. But once I got that book published, I was off and running. And every time I was hired as a storyteller, like at a library or private party or school, as soon as I finished like an hour program, there'd be a dozen people, run up to talk to me and say, well, you were talking about invisible friends, and we want to tell you about our daughter, or you were talking about Civil War ghost, and we want to tell you about what happens on our property. And so just like whatever topic you could go with a group of people, then people chime in and say, yeah, either me or a family member or a friend has a story. So I kind of got known as the person to, is willing to listen to people and believe them and hear their stories. So after the Shaker ghost stories, I wrote a couple fiction ghost stories because I knew it'd take a while to get another nonfiction book together. And then the Civil War ghost, and that includes, and you might be of interest for the folks in Tennessee, and I could share some of those stories. Yeah, in our time together. So, but the backstory to that is, I had a couple of ghost story books out, and I was in Frankfort, Kentucky at the Kentucky Book Fair, and this guy dressed as a Civil War general walked up, and I didn't know him, and he said, "We need to write a book together." And I said, "Well, who the heck are you, and what book do you want to write?" Well, he said, "I'm Brian Bush. I'm a Civil War historian and reenactor, and let me tell you, things are happening to us all the time." So Brian was great. He's my co-author. He's a walking encyclopedia. And so we wrote the book together. He had the history. He's just amazing for what he knows. And I collected the mystery and interviewed a lot of reenactors. So I did have some stories from Tennessee, some Civil War ghost stories, and some stories from Charrett Creek near Jamestown. And it's amazing. I just love, meeting folks, and I love their stories. And if it's not a ghost, story, they may have a story of an angel encounter, and that has a characteristic to it also. So I just put it all in the book. I don't really edit it. It's just whatever they say. And maybe sometimes I do a little historical research just to put in there to, for some context. But some folks, they live up in hills and hollers, so that's how they talk, and that's how their story goes about a haint. And other folks, have a different, background and education, so they may tell their story different than the down home folks, but it's still an active world, and there's ghosts and spirits everywhere. And a lot of people think, there's only ghosts at those famous places, like in Kentucky and Louisville here we got, Waverly Hills, the haunted tuberculosis sanatorium. So people just kind of put all their, energies on just those famous places, but a lot of hauntings are just, people's regular homes. It's not like anybody famous. And so that's kind of almost like a trope in the ghost story world, that it can only be, someone really famous. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I love to do on this show, and talking to different people is about the lesser known places. Like like you said, it's fine to talk about Waverly Hills and some of the bigger well-known spots that have been on TV and that type of stuff. But, I love to talk about the stories that people haven't heard. And what the book that caught my attention why you wanted you on the show was the Haunted Battlefields of the South. But it's hard to get that history because a lot of the park rangers, they don't talk about it. They don't promote the paranormal stuff. Most of the battlefields you can't go in after dark, so now a lot of people are investigating them. So what's great is that, people like you are going around collecting these stories and putting them in a book for people to read and to pass down to younger generations.
Right, exactly. That's so true. I've found that out time and again. Like there's a place here, historical place called Locust Grove, from the late 1700s and onward. You get a vibe. You just can walk around. If you're sensitive, and I am sensitive, you can just feel it. It's like dripping in the atmosphere of the buildings or the house, or, just a trauma if there was a battle on the land itself. And so when I was at Locust Grove, I went straight to the director and I said, well, do you have any ghost stories here? And of course, the lady said, no, we don't have anything like that here. And then I walked around the corner, talked to the docents and the maintenance guys and, the volunteers, and they had tons of stories. So there's a big disconnect. I think the historical places, like even Shakertown, my first book, they want to have maintain this kind of, reputation or aura of professionality. And so they distance themselves, or they'll outright deny it. There's a lot of people that just checked out at Shakertown in the middle of the night, went to the front desk and said, we're upset because you didn't tell us this place is crazy haunted, and they had a dramatic experience. So the unfortunate thing there is I think the institutions lose some credibility. There's a way to present it, I think, as a storytelling, or even if they have to say it's folklore. But still, I think they need to be honest about what people are experiencing there, whether it's the visitor or the employee. And so there is a disconnect, and it's really frustrated me over the years because it's not like I say they're lying, but I know they've heard stories,
Right.
Because all the employees, in fact, at Shakertown, they just had coined a phrase. When a new employee started, they would just ask them, "Have you had your Shaker experience yet?" Meaning, have you seen a Shaker ghost? And particularly for those historical places where people are dressed, it's not like they're wearing, service uniforms. The people at Shakertown, that were hired as interpreters, they would dress, in period reproduction clothing. And so that's when things got fascinating, because you would see someone walking down the village lane, and then, well, how come they didn't say hi? One of the employees. The employees are really friendly. And then you do a double take, whip your head around, do a Scooby-Doo, and, there's nobody there. But that's the wonderful thing. And same thing with the Civil War reenactors. Honestly, I think the ghosts just look at them as fellow soldiers, because they're dressed in the blue or gray or butternut or whatever. They're, got the realistic, looking weapons. They're firing off cannons. They're there at the location of the terrible battles. They're there at the anniversary. So it's like, one-armed bandit gambling. You've lined up all the charities, and you pull the lever, and, you're going to get something happening. So a lot of the stories in haunted battlefields of the South, they are from reenactors, and they're not just, I heard something over there. But like I said, the ghosts look at them as fellow soldiers. There's one guy, he was in his own little tent in Perryville, which was a pretty big battle in Kentucky. And his other buddies were in their own tents, and it was raining, but he felt someone just shove him awake in the middle of the night. And he looked up, and there was a guy, as the reenactors say, looking very battle authentic. And he was dressed Confederate, and the rain was actually dripping off the brim of his hat. He was kneeling down, his rifle was up against his shoulder, and he said, "The captain needs you up on the line." So here's the ghost telling the reenactor that it's his turn for sentry duty. And the reenactor just, didn't believe it. I'm dreaming. He turned over and tried to go back to sleep, and the ghost shoved him awake again. He said, "Come on, it's your turn. Here, you can use my rifle." And then the ghost disappeared, but the guy still refused to believe it was a ghost. He thought, it's my buddies, they're having me on. So he just kind of got himself woken up for a minute and put on a jacket. And he said, I know what I'll do. I'll just look out the tent flap here, and I'll just follow the tracks in the mud, and it'll take me to whatever tent of my buddy that's having me on. Of course, you can guess what happened when he lifted the tent flap.
Yeah.
So honestly, the ghost, Civil War ghosts, when they see the reenactors, they just see fellow soldiers. And in fact, that's so real, I think, for both parties, that sometimes there's been this kind of panicky moment where the ghost realized, in a dark campfire. This story is from Perryville also, I believe, but the reenactors were dressed in blue. They were portraying Union soldiers, and it was really dark. It was a campfire, and somebody wandered in, and they offered him, would you like some coffee? And he just kind of nodded yes. And the guy that poured the coffee, but when he reached over to hand him the coffee cup, the ghost, who was dressed Confederate, could see in the light, that it was a blue uniform on his sleeve. And they said he just turned around and took off running. But as he ran, after about 20 feet, he just started dissolving into the darkness.
Wow. And that's one reason why a lot of paranormal investigators try to use trigger objects and that type stuff, because especially in those places, it brings about that activity, because maybe some of those ghosts are still living in that time and don't know that, the battle's over, the war's over, because they died in such a quick, tragic way.
Exactly, and I think that's a good point. I think there's things, because I know at Shakertown, we would perform in the 1820 meeting house. We're volunteers. We didn't get paid at all. Some of the folks were employees. But there were things that almost seemed to be like triggers to call in the spirits. And obviously, singing the original Shaker music, that was one. They didn't have instruments, so it's all vocal. And we would stomp and shout, and we had scripted performance. We would do a Shaker prayer meeting. We'd do a Shaker funeral. We would call out and, fall slain in the spirit. We were fully in character to portray as best we could figure out, how they danced and sang. And of course, we had their journals, we had their information. They had had shared and written that came down through the ages, particularly their music. But that is what I think called in the spirits. And like you're saying, same thing for the Civil War ghosts. So if I get out my harmonica and start playing When Johnny Comes Marching Home Again, and I'm there, at a Civil War battlefield, you can bet that that's just an open invitation to the spirits. Like, that's that universal thing, of song and music. And so there's all kinds of ways, I think, that you can connect. And, of course, the reenactors very much respect and admire what the soldiers went through. And I think they just have a like mind. Maybe if some folks might believe in reincarnation, maybe some of those reenactors feel so drawn to these terrible battles that maybe, they're just kind of reliving, the life that they had. And who knows if, the ghosts they attract could be, their buddies from those bygone days that they actually had a life with. Let's see, one interesting thing, and it's kind of along that vein of, how you can attract and bring in the Civil War ghost, is that people from different parts of the country, when they walk the battlefield, they will have a different reaction if they're walking through a certain encampment. So one lady, she used to live in Cross Plains, Tennessee, and she had some stories from Stones River. So this is in the book. Her name is Dorothy Kress, and she had family from Chicago, from the north. She had family there from Tennessee and from the south, and literally family that had fought, as you can imagine it. So it was in those days from both sides.
Yeah.
She said a funny thing happened. They had a reunion down at Stones River. Family from the north came down, and when the family from the north was walking through what was historically the southern, the Confederate encampment, they just reported this odd feeling of it just felt like we're walking through cobwebs, like there was a resistance. And the same thing happened, on the other hand, for the family that was from the south. When they were walking through the Union, what was historically the Union encampment, they felt that resistance too. And then on the other hand, vice versa for when they were in kind of like their own territory. When the folks from Chicago were walking through the Union, they felt no resistance. And the folks from Tennessee walking through the Confederate encampment areas, they felt no resistance either. So even after 150 years, there's something on that other side that recognizes us, that, maybe assesses our soul. Or, a lot of people think that ghost stories are only psychic imprints, that there's no soul left there, there's no interactivity, in real time. It's just like, if that lady jumped off the bridge and committed suicide, that's all you ever see is just, part of that scene of that fatal plunge.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stories I've heard contradict that, where you just, you see people reacting in real time, including, how the spirits, and this is a classic thing. You think about the teenagers that dare each other to stay in a haunted house. And, let's say maybe there's a half a dozen of them. And one of them, of course, and with great bravado says, well, I don't believe, ghost. And then instantly, like, okay, he's marked for the night, because the ghosts are going to and show him, that he's thinking in error. But Dorothy said that she went with her son, who was 19 years old, and they went one winter by themselves to Stones River. And like most 19-year-olds, he was incredibly wise. And what did Mark Twain say? He had been gone for a few years, out doing some adventures out west, and he came back and he remarked that I was amazed how much my dad gained in wisdom. So, 19-year-olds know everything. And
right.
Dorothy is what I call a psychic attractor. So if there's a ghost in the area, she's going to pick up on it. And she has a lot of stories from other places she's lived. But so she's walking the battlefield at Stones River. It's November. It's kind of chilly. And her son starts waving, like taking his hands and waving around his face. And she looks at him and said, "What's the matter with you?" He says, These flies are buzzing all around my face." She just looks at him and says, "There's no flies here. It's late November. Those are bullets whizzing past your head." He shakes his head and says, "No, Mom, I don't believe in that stuff. All that stuff you've been telling me all these decades, that's a bunch of hogwash." Well, Dorothy, she had seen 9/11 happen before it happened. After the first plane hit, she called the FBI and said there's 4 more planes. After the second plane hit, she called the FBI back. They were kept telling her, "Ma'am, we got things under control. Don't worry about it." And after the third plane, and she had predicted each one, they said, "Ma'am, how do you know this?" So Dorothy sees things. She just, she's got tons of stories. But so this is how it went at Stones River as they walked around. They could feel the vibration of cavalry, the horses wheeling around. They heard shouts lieutenants and captains shout, to shoot volleys. They could hear all the sounds of battle. They could hear men in the march and canteens scraping past, scrub bushes and trees that no longer existed. They heard, cannon go off, and he kept trying to look over the brow of the hill, their son, and he said, "Mom, where are the reenactors today?" And she shakes her head and says, "No, don't you understand? This is what happens when you walk the battlefield." She says, "There's no reenactors set up today." So, and then things got interesting. So as they were walking still further, there was a clearing between two sets of woods, and out of the right, one set of woods came a Union gentleman, soldier, older man, and he pointed his rifle across the clearing, not at them, but across the clearing there was a Confederate, a young man, and he pointed his rifle also. And the older man said, "Son, put down your rifle." And the younger man said, "Dad, you put down yours." And this went back and forth a few times. The father shot his own son. He went over to his son, and he was shot and fell next to him. And then the vision of all that disappeared. And Dorothy turned to her son and said, "We've got to go report this right now. Ranger station, I'll tell you, they'll laugh at us." So by this time, Dorothy's son was to form an alternative opinion about whether there's such things as ghosts and Civil War ghosts. They went to talk to the ranger. It was a lady, and she listened to them. They told everything they had seen, and she started laughing, but not because she didn't believe them. She says, "Well, you wouldn't believe how many people have reported seeing that same scene."
Wow, so that made her son a true believer after that. He saw it right in front of his very own eyes.
Yeah, and I think that's the way it usually is. People have to have something happen, and if they're not too close-minded, maybe they can, alter their view about those kind of things. And it's understandable that if we've never seen a ghost, but I can tell you, you can have two people standing right next to each other, and one says, "Holy cow, look at that ghost," and the other person says, "I don't see anything," or maybe they just see a little misty kind of thing, but they don't see a figure. So there are people that are have greater sensitivity, and actually, I think a lot of paranormal investigators, the best person on the team is the psychic, and they'll say, point your camera or your EMF, your infrared meter, point it over that direction, or turn on your digital recorder now, because the spirits. I've had a little chat with them, and they're ready to talk now. So I think you get kind of another point of view if you get that sensitive person on the team, and it's part of the whole investigation. So not only the technical, but also the the intuitive, because there's always different ways of knowing.
Yeah, and I have an interesting story speaking about experience on battlefields, and I don't think I've told this one on the show yet, but at Carton Plantation in Franklin, Tennessee, which is part of the Battle of Franklin, they use Carton as a field hospital, and there's still bloodstains, major bloodstains in the hardwood floors. I was walking across the field. There's a big field that separates the house and the cemetery, and I was walking across the field, and they hadn't mowed it in a while, so it was almost knee deep. And I hear a horse galloping to my left, and you could hear the horse whinny. And then I just felt this cold breeze go through me, and when I looked out to my right, I could still hear the horse galloping, and the grass was moving in a straight line away from me. So I think I got ran through by a ghost horse on the Franklin battlefield.
And that's fascinating, because that illustrates a couple things. And I've heard actually a similar story from a lady, and she was staying with friends in Virginia and had no idea that there was a big battle there. She was just, staying with friends, and I think they had like maybe they didn't have an extra bed, so she was just maybe on some kind of cushions or something. But anyway, she was close to the ground, and she felt, the first thing she felt was the vibration of the cavalry, and then it kind of went on from there, and she heard all kinds of sounds outside. To this day, she wished she would have been brave enough to actually, open the door and look outside. But a lot of times people will get a visual, but other times it's the sounds, and it's really unmistakable. I mean, you know that experience of a horse. He said, "My recent experience with a spirit involves a Civil War ghost, and it was not scary. I live very close to Kennesaw Battlefield. Part of the battle, a cavalry skirmish, occurred at Mud Creek, which is less than a mile away. I have found copies of period military dispatches describing the area and battles around my house. One report from June 17, 1864 states that, quote, General McCook's division of cavalry turned the enemy's left flank during the afternoon, driving his cavalry across Mud Creek on the Dallas and Marietta Road to within 6 miles of Marietta, unquote. I am a night owl. I work 15 years on the third shift in an emergency room doing x-rays. I quit in 2008 due to my bad back. One night this past year, 2009, I don't know the date for sure, but it was late spring or early summer. I awoke and saw in my bedroom, I swear, the outline of what looked like a soldier on a horse, no less. And now that I look at the date of the dispatch, I wonder if it was June 17th. Anyway, it was a very fleeting glimpse and only lasted 5 to 10 seconds before the image disappeared. The figure did not move, and it wasn't in color. It was more of a tannish mist. I wasn't afraid of it as it lasted only a few seconds. Specifically, what happened was I woke up, looked over to the left foot of my bed, and a couple feet beyond was this mist of someone in Civil War gear on a horse with a hat. I was thinking it seemed to be a Confederate soldier. Anyway, a few months passed, and I was on Twitter. I think Halloween was coming up. I mentioned something about ghosts, and the next thing I know, a paranormal investigation group is following me. That's the way Twitter works. You can search with different software like TweetDeck on keywords, and you can find every post that has that word. So I noticed them following me, and I sent them a tweet telling them they should investigate Marietta Square, which is about 5 to 6 miles from my house. The square is so haunted they even have ghost tours. They have one building there, Kennesaw House, which is allegedly very haunted. I decided to do an internet search, and I sent out the link about the haunted places around here. I contacted the reporter of an article I found almost immediately, and he told me that he was the only one to come forward since the story came out. They said in the story that there were sightings of a Union soldier. I went online and found a photo of a Union cavalryman reenactor, which mostly matched the ghostly image I saw. I did not see him with a saber like others claim. My ghost had his hands in the reins. Sometimes I hear things in the house. It sounds like someone is home and it's just me there. I have a double-sized bedroom, and it was one of the main reasons I bought the house. This home model can be 3 or 4 bedrooms. We have the 3-bedroom version. We have 2 bedrooms diagonal to each other, and there are 2 ceilings and ceiling fans and 2 areas to put TVs, etc. Since moving in, I have heard things on the other side of the bedroom, the side toward where I saw the soldier. Also, I once took my daughter when she was around 2 over to Cheatham Hill. That is the bloodiest section of the Kennesaw battle. She was sitting on the Illinois Monument and playing with a couple of sticks. I was taking photos. One photo had a very large white orb, and in the photo she is kind of holding the sticks in a V. I always wondered if that was a ghost of an Illinois soldier. They were slaughtered there. It was like a mini Fredericksburg, but they ended up winning the war.
Wow, that's a pretty amazing account.
There's another set of stories from Tennessee. I just was looking at, stories from the Tennessee area. And of course, there's a lot, Civil War and other ghostly tales in Kentucky. But Cherritt Creek is kind of interesting. It's part of the Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area.
Yeah.
I spoke with a ranger there, and he talked about early settlers building that cabin that was there in the 1820s, and that it later became the Cherritt Creek Lodge. He said one seasonal park ranger experienced something unusual years ago. The site was empty of visitors. While sleeping in one cabin, he woke to see a ghostly figure standing on the opposite side of the cabin room. They believe that's William Riley Hatfield. So this is not so much this first part about Civil War ghosts, but they talk about Cherritt Creek. It's a short name for Charity, and that there was a girl named Charity who, with her brother and parents, lived in the areas in the 1920s. They were caught outside a huge thunderstorm, and as they tried to cross the creek to get home, Charity was carried away to the junction of Station, Camp Creek, and drowned. The park ranger spoke with an older woman who said she was born in the same house where Charity and her family once lived. She was born there shortly after the drowning. She claims that local folks and visitors have seen the ghost of Charity playing down at the creek. And then there is a Civil War-related story from Cherritt Creek, too. There's a small gravesite a half-mile upstream from the Cherritt Creek Lodge. It has 2 fieldstone grave markers of the young Tackett boys who died. There's a faint scratching on the stone, which carries the date 1863. In that year, Civil War guerrillas terrorized the pro-Union area residents looking for young men to take prisoner. The mother of these 2 boys, knowing the boys would have no time to escape, put them under her feather mattress and lay on top of them, pretending to be sick. But the boys suffocated. It is said that they were hidden to save their lives, but in the process they were accidentally killed. The little graveyard is protected by the rail fence, which was put in place by the Park Service. The old Tackett Cavern site is still visible, with only the chimney showing, and the graves are 150 feet behind the cabin site. People have reported glowing orbs or light near the graves of the boys. And then there's more information about a famous southern guerrilla named Champ Ferguson and some action there. So, but those are a few of the Tennessee ghostly tales from the haunted battlefields of the South.
And you have another book called Eerie Encounters in Everyday Life. I talk about a lot of historical stuff and battlefields and that type of stuff, but I'm also interested in, people's just stories. And one of the things that came up the other day, I was interviewing Dr. Alan Brown. He's an English professor in Alabama, and he's also a paranormal author, and he collects stories like you do. And one of the things that he said he noticed, because he's from up north, is that down in the South, there are more stories because he thinks that people are more apt to tell them. Have you encountered that with writing your books and talking to all these people?
I think there's something to that. Could be that oral tradition is a little stronger. I haven't made a study of it, but I have lived in Kentucky, and people seem to, be very, very proud of their stories. And sometimes you may not, hear the story right off, or you might visit a community and you kind of have no idea. Maybe if you don't know the history there. I in the hills and hollers up there in Hayden, in Leslie County, Kentucky. I was hired as an artist in residence, and I stayed a couple weeks, and they found a place for me to stay. And it was a lady who started up a nursing service 100 years ago. And Mary Breckenridge came from a rich family, but she kind of gave it all up and used her funds, her money she had available, and she trained women to be nurses and to take mules and horses up in the hills and hollers. And, because all these women were dying in childbirth, and people were not in taken care of very well that way. So, but they said, "Oh, you can stay in the Mary Breckenridge home." So I thought, okay, that'll be interesting. So I stayed there, and you could, it was just one of those places you could feel it. There's just a heavy presence. And I wasn't like doing investigations, and I was busy doing work back then as a visual artist through the Kentucky Arts Council. But I would get my car and go each day to the little school and follow the coal trucks. But a couple things happened. So I would get set up on Sunday and stay Sunday evening through Thursday evening, and then work Monday through Friday, and then head back. I was then living in Lexington, Kentucky. One of the teachers pulled me aside on Friday the first week and said, "Well, just so I let you know, there's another artist coming in. He's a Native American guy, Phil Silverthorne. He's come from North Carolina. He might come in, after your sleep. We just thought I'd let you know." I said, "Okay, fine." So the second week, I arrived Sunday and got settled in, and I didn't see him, so it was about 9:30. I think I'll tuck it in. So I was just drifting off to sleep. It was maybe about 10, and I heard there's a racket in another bedroom up there, and I thought, well, I guess that's Phil. He's getting in. But there was like, hauling a whole bus full of luggage, banging around and stuff. And like it always happens with ghosts, the second you decide, okay, I'm going to get up and deal with this, it stops. Because the ghost, they can read thoughts, and they just, like, okay, I had a little fun there, do the Nelson laugh like on The Simpsons. So I drifted off to sleep finally, and then went up, did the work the next day, Monday, and toward the end of the day, I talked to one of the teachers. I said, "Man, that other artist, he sure made a lot of noise when he came in last night." And he gave me a funny look, cocked his head, and he said, "Oh no, Phil didn't make it in last night." So maybe that was Mary Breckenridge wondering what this guy was doing in her house. No. But the other thing, and once again, this is like how people keep, that tradition and those stories. Another thing happened in that town. And so after working a day or two, I would drive to get to that one school. I go a right turn out of the Mary Breckenridge home through Hayden, and then followed the directions. And they said, "Oh, no, you don't, you can go a shorter way." They said, "Take a left out of the Mary Breckenridge home, take a first left, and just take that cut through." So I did that all the rest of the time, going back and forth. And I like to explore places, and I'm like a little bit of a rock hound, and so abandoned places. So there, as I drove past, each time going up and back, I saw this place. It looked like maybe a quarry or something, and there was a chain across there like you couldn't drive through it. But I thought, well, I can park just outside that chain and go walking around. But something, that intuition, I tell kids, you don't need an EMF meter because you can just tune into your solar plexus and you'll know whether or not you're supposed to be somewhere. If there's a ghost that is not very pleasant in that spot. But, I had that gut feeling, just leave it alone, even though it was, March and the days were getting longer and it was sunny and I wanted to explore and, get out and stretch my feet after working in the school all day. But nope, something kept telling me, just leave it alone. So the final evening was Thursday. They had a potluck for us artists. And it was really nice, and all the local folks there, and we were chatting about stuff, and I said, say, you know, that cut through you told me to make on the whatchamacallit road, and I started talking about that, and I said, what's the deal with that thing? Looks like a quarry there or something, and, you know, I just had a funny feeling, and it just, and it was like everyone stopped with like their plastic forks, you know, with their potluck spoonful or forkful, like, you know, like halfway up to their mouth. They just froze. All the conversation stopped. It was like you could drop a pin and hear it. And they just looked at me, and one person said, well, didn't nobody tell you? And I said, well, tell me what? I don't know what you're talking about. Well, there was a mine explosion in there, and 75 men died.
Oh, wow. Wow. And they're like, yeah, the new guy has no idea.
Yeah, they just capped it up. And so sometimes, you know, you just don't know. They'll tell you, but if you kind of just don't know unless you start talking about it, and you might pick up the feelings. And so a lot of times on my travels, I've kind of stumbled into ghost stories that way where it's just that your sixth sense, you know, just your spider senses are kind of tingling, like, you know, there's something about this spot. Of course, in America, you know, we build a Walmart, and it's like, okay, well, that's all it ever is. It's a Walmart now. Well, you know, what was it 100 years ago? Was there, you know, a Civil War action? Or 200 years ago, was some Native American, you know, or was it a burial ground? And so, but we're, you know, we kind of tend to brush aside history in America. But I think there are some regions maybe where they do hold on to their history and that lore a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think living in Tennessee, I know specifically because, you know, I grew up here, born and raised, but living here, I think there are places like Franklin, Tennessee, and like Murfreesboro, where the Stones River battlefield is, and even like Chattanooga, Memphis, Nashville, somewhat about the history, but not as much. But, yeah.
Well, you mentioned the Carnelton Mansion, and I do have a story from there. And it's very simple. There was a tour, and they were downstairs, and it was the couple that were telling the story. The lady was kind of, you know, just antsy, and you know, after a while, you just listen to someone kind of droning on and on about some trivia, and she just decided to wander around by herself. She went upstairs. Now, there's something about these antebellum mansions, or any home that within 20 miles of a terrible battle, as they were used as field hospitals. And the second or third floor was actually the choice spot to do the amputations, because if you picked the first floor, after a while, after about an hour or so, you just couldn't throw anything out the window anymore, because the pile of amputated limbs just, you know, there was no room to throw it out. So they would. So she inadvertently didn't know that she was heading up there to have a rendezvous with another dimension and a time shift. So she wandered up to an upper level. I can't remember the second or third floor. And as she opened the door was close to that room. She literally saw the scene that was occurring, you know, back at the time of the battle, and literally saw the surgeon, hands full, apron bloody, some attendants around, someone on a table, you know, like a makeshift, on a door that was like a makeshift table, and literally, like, she just almost fainted. And then the surgeon looked up and said, "Oh, thank God, we have another couple hands to help." She turned tail and ran down and just, you know, grabbed her husband's hand. And he looked up startled, and he said, "You know, you could imagine, you look like you just seen a ghost."
Yeah. And I've been to Carton many times. It's only about 20 minutes from my house, and it's on the second floor, and they have the scene set up with the old door, like on some sawhorse type deals, and they got the old medical instruments in there. And there's actually the blood stains on the floor. There's one that's a perfect circle where there's no blood, but there's blood all around it. Like they had a bucket sitting there, like a bucket of water. And there's there's another one that's kind of a big horseshoe shape, and it looks like it's where maybe the surgeon was standing with like an apron on. And so the horseshoe shape, there's no blood inside of it, but all around it, there's these major blood stains. And like the surgeon just stood in this spot for so long and amputated so many limbs, and there's so much blood, and he didn't move because there were so many wounded people that needed his help with taking out, you know, mini balls or doing amputations.
Right. You know, one thing I think of when, you know, you think of the terrible price that was paid, you know, of course, who would know that better than those soldiers? So one guy talked about, and I can't remember where this was, it was down south, maybe Alabama, but it was just the classic, historical plaque, and it was elevated position that the Confederates had been defending, and the Union had fought upward up the hill. And there was like a reproduction or an actual cannon, that was stationed there and everything. And he was just, you just kind of reading through the plaque and try to imagine that we didn't have to imagine much anymore, because he felt these invisible hands grab his shoulders and torque him around to face downhill. And he heard a voice say, "This is what we saw that day. Never let it happen again."
Oh, wow.
And I think it provides an answer to people that say, "Oh, well, surely those poor souls have gone on into the light." But, when you die, when you enter the spirit realm, there's no time and space. So it's not like they're sitting around watching the calendars go, "Oh, geez, another year here." But, like you said, they're still acting or reenacting that trauma. For them, there is no separation. They are still living that, and they know the terrible trauma. And as you look around, obviously, in the political division that we have in our country, it doesn't take much imagination to see that, there is potential still for deep division. And so I think that's why, these Civil War soldiers are still around. Of course, we think it's 150 years plus, but to them, it's just a moment in elusive time. But I think they're still around to warn us about the terrible cost. They know, and they know that we still need that message to be brought home.
Yeah. And so they still have a purpose, and that's why they're still around. Yeah.
Exactly.
And you do a lot of work with kids, with children, with the art therapy stuff and being an artist. And I've heard you on other shows talk about some of the stories that you've had from kids, from when you're doing a speaking engagement, telling stories to kids. And what are some of the creepier ones? Because kids can be a little creepy sometimes.
Oh, I'll be happy to tell you, because I have to say, they talk about most of the iceberg, is underwater. You just in 1/10 above, and in the body of literature or whatever, in the realm of ghost stories, most of them are actually either experienced by children or, the person telling the story is an adult now, but it happened when they were children.
Yeah.
Because, that's when we're most open. That's when we've recently come from the spirit realm. And children don't have their belief system calcified. I mean, you can be a grown-up. You can see half a dozen ghosts, and you can just kind of file it away like, "I didn't see that." You did, but he didn't, because it's that does not compute kind of, mismatch, because we're not supposed to see them. We're not supposed to be interacting with the spirit world. We're obsessed in the Western world with, just physicality and, like if it's not solid, it's not real. But, of course, in traditional tribal societies, they're taught the opposite worldview. They say, the spirit realm is real and the physical is just an illusion. But we have, the way we're raised, the way we're socialized, it's just gradually convinced out of us that we're not seeing these things. But so if you want to know what's really going on, you can see how your pets respond to a particular home or location, and they'll let you know, the cats and dogs or horses, and also the children. So I've got a lot of stories from children. I have chilling stories of invisible friends. Children who have portals, and if a kid says there's something under the bed or there's something in the closet, you know what? I would listen to them. And I can tell you some stories in just a moment to illustrate that. But unfortunately, a lot of parents, because they can't handle it, they never resolved the idea of ghosts from their childhood. So they're stuck at age 12 or whatever, because we have developmental levels for our physical, emotional, social, learning as we go through our life. But we also have developmental levels for spiritual or metaphysical or psychic things. And if we didn't figure something out or we're stuck with something, then we're at whatever developmental age, whenever that happens. So let's say there was like a 13-year-old girl, she lives in a neighborhood, and she thinks about that guy down the street, that old guy, that he's going to die, and then 2 days later he dies. But she takes that, internalizes it like, I caused that. She freaks out, and then, she doesn't want to have anything to do with anything spiritual or metaphysical for the rest of her life. So then when she has a little child that, has an invisible friend, she wants to shut that down, or, "Oh, honey, we're going to sell our house someday. You can't talk about this stuff at school," or, it's just your imagination. So literally, I know people who are adults now, and they can tell you the moment that they were shut down by a family member because they had a gift. So children see ghosts just as much, if not more, than grown-ups. So I'll tell you about Jacob. He lived with his family, and they were from Ohio, but they were living out in Hawaii because of his dad's job. And Jacob was 8 years old, and one day he came into to the kitchen, said to Mom at breakfast time, "Mom, God is walking through the walls at night." Doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
But you think about it, kids use whatever schema they have at their developmental level. And he had just seen a movie called Bruce Almighty, and God was a black man.
Yeah.
So if you interpret what Jacob was saying, he was saying, I'm seeing a native Hawaiian spirit come through a portal in my bedroom. But obviously, he didn't say it that way because, he just had to use the 8-year-old language. So to their credit, and this is unusual, the parents listened to him. They had him sketch the figure, which I have, scanned, and it's in one of my books. And they hired a Hawaiian shaman who came and closed the portal. And so everyone moved up a developmental level. Like not only Jacob, because he saw, mature adults handle it, listen to him, not deny him, not tell him to shut up, not tell him, oh, it's just your dreams. There's actually children who talk about past life stuff that can be verified. There's a famous case that Steven Spielberg optioned it as a movie, and it's a boy in Louisiana. Well, they moved to Texas, but he had a lot of information about a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier that he served on in another life, and he knew the name of his fellow flyers. His dad took him, when they moved to Texas, to the Confederate, I think it was a different name, but it used to be called the Confederate Air Force Museum, and the boy went right up to the plane that he flew, and he was naming all kinds of parts and stuff, and his dad was just standing there with an open mouth, and his parents were fundamentalist Christians, so his dad listening to all this stuff, he said, well, this is obviously not true. So he started getting online to disprove it. But guess what? Yep. He ended up validating everything the boy said. They actually ended up going to Japan, to the one island where he was shot down, and throwing a wreath in the water. And the boy said, my sisters are still alive in Iowa. And they found the sisters. So, children say the darndest thing. But I do have some invisible friend stories here in Louisville. I met a lady and her daughter, who's probably now around 35 or maybe even later. They were visiting, we have a really lovely museum here called the Speed Art Museum. And the basement is where the Native American exhibit is. Well, Jan was upstairs and her daughter wandered downstairs and she said, oh, well, she's down in that Native American exhibit. And she just was busy talking to someone. And finally she went down and was calling her and looking down the long hallway. And her daughter was standing there, turned 90 degrees like she's talking to someone else. And she's calling her. And finally, she walked up and said, honey, I've been calling you. He said, no, honey, I've been talking to this nice guy with the feather headdress. So, kids, they just, maybe they attract the spirits because they're innocent and they're open. But there's a lot of stories of invisible friends. One lady in Ohio, she emailed me her account, and her daughter at the time was 5 years old when this happened, and she had a 13-year-old son. And they live in a really old home, and they lived in the third floor. There was other rentals in the first and second floors, and things would happen, just weird things. So this lady would take her 2 children and maybe go shopping and be gone for about 3 hours, and came back. The lady in the middle level, came charging out of her door into the hallway and said, you got to tell your kids to stop running back and forth up there. And she said, We've just been gone for 3 hours. What are you talking about? So something was going on. But her daughter started talking about this friend. And literally her daughter had never been to a museum, described in perfect historical detail what a little girl would look like in the late 1800s, even down, the ribbon in the hair and down to the hobnob boots. And she said, this girl says she has to use a metal hook to, lace up her shoes. And she's telling that, and the mom's listening, and the grandmother's there, and the grandmother, she's really starting to pay attention because she had to wear those when she was a child, and the girl said it hurt her shins, in this one spot, and the grandmother, validated that. She knew that was a genuine historical detail because they hurt her shins, when she wore those shoes too. But the girl kept talking about, it was the usual stuff, like you can't sit there, so-and-so sitting there, you got to have a place at the table. The girl would have little tea parties with their friend. But, sometimes real kids, mortal children have a falling out. They're friends and then they're not friends, and maybe they're friends again, or maybe they're frenemies. This little girl and the ghost girl, the invisible friend, had a falling out, and she was starting to say mean things about her mom, and the little girl was, standing up for her mom. So it all came to a head one night when the teenage brother heard something and ran into his sister's bedroom. Now, I have to say that if you know what modern windows are like, you can just take one finger of these aluminum windows and lift them up. But, the old windows, they're real heavy, wood and the glass, and there's a kind of like a rope with a lead sash, a weight there, in the wall
like
and everything.
a counterweight
Yeah,
system.
okay. So plus if they get out of square, so basically you have to know for the story that it would take 2 adults to open up any of the windows. But he ran in there, flipped on the light, and the little girl was halfway crawled out the 3rd floor open window.
Wow.
So he went and grabbed her, obviously, saving her from, she could have been really seriously hurt. And she said that her friend, the invisible friend, was hovering outside the 3rd floor window, making that, single index finger motion, like, come on out and float like me out in the air here.
One of my beliefs is that like you were saying, that kids are kind of taught out of the whole spirituality part.
Right, exactly. You're right, and it can and does, I think, run in families that sixth sense or the sensitivity, or sometimes like in the old days, it was just, it was like good old fashioned, what people could call witchery. There was, family members that knew how to kill or cure with herbs, and they had a sixth sense. They could say, when that lady was pregnant, they knew before she did, or when the cow was going to die. But I think that can run in families. So some people have even more kind of extra perception. There's a lady here I've interviewed numerous times. She's got many stories in my books. Her name's Beth Wilder, and she remembers one time just playing. You remember the old metal jacks and the little rubber ball game, and
yeah.
You just sit on the floor. Okay, so she was doing that, and she was bouncing and stuff, and then the ball kind of got away from her a little bit, and she thought, well, I wonder if I can just, with my mind, make the ball roll back to me. And she concentrated, and the ball rolled back to her.
Wow.
So she got up to run tell her mama. Big mistake, right? Her mama's got her back to her, and she's chopping vegetables in the kitchen. She blurts out what's happened. The mama spins around. Obviously, it just happens to be holding the knife to make her point. And she said, "Don't you ever do it again. That's evil."
Yeah.
So here's a little girl with obvious psychic gifts, and she's shut down immediately. And she told her dad. They were driving the Western Parkway, coming back, I think from college or something, and the girl Beth was maybe in her late 20s, early 30s, and she was telling her dad, who was open to that kind of stuff. He didn't know what had happened. And she said he was driving, he kind of slammed his hands on the steering wheel. He was so upset that he didn't know about it, that he would have, done what he can to at least acknowledge and accept and not, berate her for being able to use her own gifts. But I think, as we move into the future, we need these gifted children, and a lot of them that are gifted, they can also get a DSM diagnosis. They're diagnosed, ADHD or bipolar or whatever, but they're also the ones that are gifted. I was a counselor for 4 years in the Catholic schools here in Louisville, and basically the kids I saw in counseling were my own tribe. They were the sensitive, gifted kids, and it's just that their peers couldn't handle them. That's why they were in counseling, because they just would look at them and, shake their head and ostracize them. But yeah, there's a lot of stories. In fact, when I was at St. Agnes, a mom stopped by and she said, "You like weird stories, don't you?" I said, "Yeah, what do you got?" "Well, my daughter has an invisible friend." And I kind of cited as psychological statistics that 70% of all children have an invisible friend, but likely, in most cases, it's just imaginary, kind of exercise. And she said, "Well, you might want to hear my story." So I live in the part of Louisville that's called J-Town. Actually, Josephstown was here before Louisville. And they lived in an old farmhouse built in the late 1700s. And her daughter, who I knew was perfectly normal, she was in 5th grade then. And she said ever since she was little, she had an invisible friend. And she would talk to the other friend. It was a female. And it was the usual kind of stuff. And a lot of times, what I've heard, I think in most cases, the invisible friend is the same gender. Not always, but most of the time. And also that the invisible friend seems to be like the same age, even as the mortal child, gets, a little bit to be an older child, and et cetera. But she said her daughter, 2 years before, so this is when her daughter was in 3rd grade, had another St. Agnes student over for a sleepover. And this is in one of my books. You know how it is, sleepover, a lot of fun. You get out the sleeping bags, titter, 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 laugh, and fall asleep. But it was on the old wooden floorboards, which are, maybe not too comfortable. So the daughter woke up in the middle of the night and didn't want to wake up her friend, and she just wanted to go back to her own bed. So she did. Later in the night, they found out the friend woke up, saw a girl in the sleeping bag, and went to touch her, and her hand went through her. And for some reason, that girl didn't want to come for any more sleepovers.
Yeah, I don't want to go back to the haunted house.
Yeah, so Beth, that I mentioned before, she said when she was young, she had friends over, they would play hide and seek. And her friends, even though she was in her own home, because when you're in your own home and you're a kid, the best places to hide. It's like your home turf. She said they kept finding her. And finally she said, how come you keep finding me at my favorite hiding places? You don't know where they are. And they said, we just follow that glowing white ball of light, and it hovers over your hiding place each time.
Well, I've had fun talking to you today. Awesome stories, and I hope my audience goes and checks out some of your books. Do you have anything coming up in the near future as far as writing another book or anything like that?
Oh, thanks very much. And actually, my website has an initial L in there, in between Thomas and Freese, so it's www.thomaslfreese.com. But public performances, not so much, in this pandemic year, but I am working on a book of true fairy tales. So they're not like the old fairy tales from England and the British Isles and Ireland and Scotland, but they're encounters with those beings that live in another dimension that we call nature spirits or the fairy folk. And just like there's a lot of ghost stories out there, there's actually plenty of stories, and they're not all Tinkerbell. Some of them can look very different than, the little wing cutie, flying in the air. So I'm working on that, and let's see, I'm always collecting general collections for stories of ghost spirits and angels. I do want to write a book of just angel encounters. So if anyone out there wants to friend me on Facebook or go to my website and click contact and send a hello, on Facebook is usually where I post things when I have events coming up. In Louisville, I'll be at a metaphysical event at the end of the month called the Healing Festival. But a lot of events, as you can imagine, that I would usually be doing, and the school and the library storytelling is just kind of on abeyance for now.
Yeah. And if people want to find you on Facebook, you're under Thomas Freese, author, and it's Freese on Facebook.
Right, it's Freese, S as in Sam, E, there's no Z, so I have no connection with that Batman character. And so I have a Thomas Freese one, which is fine, and I have Thomas Freese author, so either one. And the Thomas Freese one has a picture of my children's picture book called Halloween Sleepwalker on my profile picture.
So everybody go and like his page and check out his website for more information. I will put links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Thomas, for coming on today. It's been a great conversation. I look forward to having you on again in the future.
I would like that very much. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Stay safe out there. Have a good day. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or at our website, unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And don't forget to like, review, rate, and share with all your friends. Thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. Listen to our theme song and more of his music at chrislipsmusic.com. And remember, some of the scariest things are unseen.